Thank you, and thanks for Sonia as well for inviting me today, and Colin, of course. I'm really delighted to come up all the way down here from the northeast of England and present to you the kind of research that's going on up in Newcastle and the research group that I've come from, but also to talk to you a little bit today about the 4 studies that I carried out as part of my PhD. I'm quite new to the field of CFSME and carried out my PhD only in the last 3 years, so I've been in the field for about 3.5 years now. So I'm still very much learning about it myself. But what I can bring to you today is all of the research findings that I gathered in terms of disturbed sleep in chronic fatigue syndrome and where this research might be heading next. Okay, so it's a really exciting field to work in at the minute, CFSME. And up in the northeast we have a number of research teams that are really committed to engaging with patients, and that's really important in terms of understanding the condition at the deeper level. Okay, and we have a team of researchers and clinicians that work together. So clinicians from outside of the field in their own disciplines will actually come together as part of our research team and discuss their ideas and impose their own opinions on the research that's happening. And we collaborate together and develop our ideas and potential collaborations for future projects. Our research centre is called the Newcastle University Fatigue Research Centre, and we've just actually been given that as an official title, which is quite important now. And the centre has a wider research focus as well. So it is a team of researchers and clinicians outside of the field, as I said, getting involved in one primary goal to understand this condition at a deeper level and move the research, the high quality research forward. Sonia will talk a little bit more about the multidisciplinary collaboration in a bit, but 2 years ago, Sonia, was it, the UK CFSME Collaborative launched, and it's a national goal of getting lots of clinicians and researchers in the field who are committed to delivering high quality research in the field, getting together to meet regularly and move this research forward. So this is how the research is being driven at the minute, and I'm seeing a lot more, since I've commenced my PhD, a lot more PhD students actually wanting to get involved as well, which is really promising. So here is our team. We meet probably once a month, and we bring all of our research findings together into one room and discuss how the research is going. And we cover a lot of different specialisms. So there's people who work on autonomic dysfunction. Obviously it's being led by Professor Newton at Newcastle University, who also supervised my PhD. So she's the expert there. There's people working on immune system dysfunction and neuropsychological performance. There's mitochondrial genomics, I've got sleep myself. People who work with pain patients, that their fatigue may overlap. And also there's physiotherapists as well who will get involved. We also have a clinic in the northeast called the Cresta Clinic. It's a fatigue-specific Cresta service, and it stands for Clinics for Research and Service in Themed Assessments. And what this clinic aims to do is provide patients with fatigue-associated chronic conditions, including CFSME, with a detailed assessment on when they enter the clinic, but also it provides a multidisciplinary treatment service for these patients and delivers the treatment based on what they would need first. This service also offers an opportunity for patients to get involved in ongoing research as well, so it's a really research active clinic. So more specifically on my PhD then, it was a 3-year programme of research supported by Action for ME. Thank you so much to Sonia and Action for ME for that. I wouldn't have been able to carry out the really comprehensive programme of studies without their support. And it's a collaboration between Northumbria University and Newcastle University. So again, coming together to deliver really good research. It allowed me to focus in depth on one particular aspect of the condition. 3 years is not a long time, So I really wanted to focus in depth on one particular aspect, and that I chose was sleep. At the beginning of my PhD, I had the opportunity to become involved with the UK CMRC, the collaborative that Sonia will talk about after me. But this is a really good opportunity to, as an early career researcher, get involved with lots of experts in the field who really want to make a difference to CFSME research. So my key research questions for my PhD were: what kinds of sleep abnormalities are there in NECFS patients? Are these the same for all patients? And do these impact on their existing symptoms? I also wanted to establish whether it would be feasible to deliver a really comprehensive sleep assessment intervention for this patient group, because there was a real lack of that currently in the field. So in terms of the role of sleep in CFSME, we know that there's 94% of sleep disturbance in this condition, and that's from the National Outcomes Database in the UK currently. We also know that the patterns and severity of sleep problems differ in patients. They will experience perhaps early, middle, or late insomnia-like symptoms, oversleeping, frequent awakenings, and quite disturbed sleep, with a lot of non-restorative feelings on wake. The existing sleep literature that was out there 3 years ago was very minimal, and the objective sleep studies, the research in that domain was at most 32 studies in polysomnography, so the objective measure of patient sleep. And these mostly came from America. There was not a lot going on in the UK. These showed some objective evidence of abnormalities in patient sleep, but no real consistent pattern. So there's a real gap in the area here for me to go on and study sleep in ME. So I had 4 studies that I completed throughout the 3-year period, and I used a mixed methods approach. So I began with qualitative interviews with patients, and then went on to look at subjective sleep as self-reported by sleep diaries from patients. And then we had access to polysomnography recordings from a fatigue clinic in the Netherlands, and this was the largest data set ever looked at in NECFS. So I looked at objective sleep from those, and then I carried out a 12-month detailed sleep assessment study, which the primary aim of this study was to determine how feasible it was to deliver a really comprehensive sleep assessment in this patient group. And I'll also talk about the preliminary data analysis that I carried out as well. So to begin with a qualitative interview study, my aim for this one was to understand the extent to which sleep, its management and problems were linked to the lived experience of NECFS and how it interacted with other symptoms in patients. There were no existing in-depth sleep-specific qualitative studies when I actually carried this out. But this study really was a good starting point for me in my early career researcher status, for me to engage with patients and learn as much as I could about this condition at a really deep level, because I was able to sit down one-to-one with patients and talk about their experience of the condition and what it really involved for them. So it was a really good way for me to engage with them and build a good rapport with the patient group. I carried out 11 interviews. These were face-to-face, but also involved telephone and Skype. There was one patient who actually did this over from Australia, but she was really committed to being involved, so we did it over Skype. I thematically analysed the transcripts that were audio recorded. It's currently under review, so it will be published shortly, so keep a lookout for it. But the main findings from this study were basically the narratives that patients talked about for the sleep were mainly related to frequent awakenings and arousals, but also importantly for them, it was how their sleep actually changed over the illness course. So it's quite variable over the duration of the illness. I then put together all of the main themes and sub-themes and developed 3 key areas that came about from this study. And that was the variability of sleep disturbances themselves, the effect of these sleep disturbances on patients' daytime functioning, and critically, which I thought was the key element for all patients, was their attempts at actually coping and trying to manage their disturbed sleep, which created another element of illness burden that they were already enduring. So the key message from this qualitative study with patients was that the disturbances in sleep were highly unpredictable and variable over time, but they did play a key role in the symptom experience. And that's a little word cloud I put together of the main words that came out from the interviews. I then went on to look at self-reported sleep from patients in the form of sleep diaries. And the aim of this study was to examine subjective sleep quality in patients and its associations with key dimensions of illness experience. So fatigue, sleepiness, cognitive functioning and mood. There were 101 diaries altogether. These were carried out over 2 weeks, consecutive weeks. And they also carried out functional assessments of fatigue, sleepiness, cognitive functioning and mood. The main findings from this were that there was considerable variability again in the characteristics across a sample on their sleep. Most patients were napping during the day, as you'd expect, but mostly these naps were occurring in the afternoon period, which, if you think in terms of the sleep perspective, the napping that occurs in the afternoon has more of an impact on the nighttime sleep, so it's not a good period to be napping in. The total duration of daytime napping had a negative impact on patients' cognitive functioning and levels of sleepiness. So that was an association we found through the analysis. Interestingly, patients with a shorter illness length and a longer wake time in the night were also more fatigued. So this might suggest that the longer they had the illness, the less fatigued they've become. It's just an association, so it's not really any cause or effect relationship going on here, just an idea. Then we looked at objective sleep. So a lovely clinic in the Netherlands gave us access to 343 single-night polysomnography recordings from their fatigue clinic. And we got really excited because we've never looked at this amount of data before in chronic fatigue syndrome. So it was a secondary analysis of existing data, but our aims were to identify whether sleep-specific phenotypes existed in MECFS because of the variability that we'd seen previously, and also to explore objective characteristics that may differentiate these phenotypes, but also being mindful of how this might be applied clinically in terms of treatments later. So this is how the data set was broken down. I hope you can see that. On initial analysis of the data set, 30% of patients had to be excluded on the basis of having primary sleep disorder. So those that had periodic leg movement indexes over 5 or apnea indexes over 15 met the criteria for a sleep disorder in explaining the fatigue. So the 239 patients who had unexplained fatigue, we analysed the data, and their profile of their sleep was highly variable again, so indicated the presence of phenotypes. Are there different sleep problems in this patient group? And there was some objective abnormalities that really stood out. So WASO stands for wake after sleep onset. The amount of wake these patients were having in the night was almost double of what you would consider problematic in a normal sleeper. 30 minutes or more is the threshold for abnormal WASO, abnormal wake after sleep onset. And again, this patient group in particular were having a lot more light sleep, so M1, stage 1 sleep, but also much less REM, so rapid eye movement sleep, which is a deeper sleep. They were having a lot less of this. So it does confirm objective sleep difficulties from the outset. We then did some statistics, and I can talk about this in more detail later, how we got to the 4 groups, but a cluster analysis enabled us to reach this decision, and the Ward's method enabled us to gain the largest reduction in the number of groupings, but also retain 5% of the sample size in each of the 4 groups. So we got to 4 groups after some statistics. And this gave us sleep characteristics for each group. So I'll talk through these. Type 1 was those patients characterised by long sleep onset, few awakenings, but their sleep was of normal quality. And this might reflect what you would see as sleep onset insomnia. So they were having problems getting off to sleep. Type 2 patients were those that had restless and more aroused sleep with high amounts of stage 2, which is really light sleep. Again, their sleep was of normal quality, and this is something you would see in the DSM in pain patients or those sensitive to noise. So they're really aroused. Type 3 was the largest proportion of patients that fell into this group, and those patients were characterised by few awakenings, lots of deep sleep, and lots of time spent asleep for long periods. And this might reflect what you would see in the criteria as hypersomnolence. Okay, so a lot of different sleep characteristics between these groups. And the final group was type 4, who was characterised by having a lot of awakenings, but very short sleep duration as well. And this looks something you might see in sleep disorders as sleep maintenance insomnia. So we've got 4 key sleep problems going on here in this big patient cohort. Interestingly, we didn't have access to this information, but length of illness might play a critical part. The key finding of my qualitative study in that patients reported changes over the illness course in their sleep problems might mean that patients with MECFS actually fall into more than one of these sleep types across the illness trajectory. So that's something that future research into sleep might want to look at in more detail. Okay. Also important to bear in mind is each of these sleep types will benefit from different treatments for their sleep. It's not one fits all in terms of the treatment for their sleep problems. And these might be therapeutic, pharmacological, or benefit from more adjunct therapies and holistic approaches to sleep management. My final study was my most enjoyable one of all, because I really got to spend a lot of time with patients, and that's what I really enjoyed about my PhD. The study was more about feasibility, so how it worked with this patient group rather than the actual data we got at the end of it. But I will cover some of the data in a bit. So the aim of this was to determine the feasibility of a detailed 3-night sleep assessment protocol in a small group of patients with MECFS. So it was the pilot of the most comprehensive sleep study ever attempted in this population, and it utilised mixed methods, so functional assessments of symptoms, actigraphy, so wrist accelerometry to look at the movement during the day and night, sleep diaries over 2 weeks prior to the study and throughout the 3 days, ambulatory PSG, so this is polysomnography, electrodes on the head, face, and body monitoring, but in patients' homes, so it was taken out of the lab and done in the comfort of their own homes. And we also took samples of saliva to assess cortisol. Again, it was done in patients' homes, so a natural setting, and over 3 consecutive days and nights. So it's quite an intensive protocol. And this is impossible for you all to see, but I'll talk you through it a little bit. It basically shows how it took 12 months to complete the study. Initially, we anticipated to recruit controls and normal sleeper controls to the study, but then realised I would not have time to complete my full patient group, so I then focused on the patients only. So patients went through a screening process. to rule out any unexplained primary sleep disorder. And from those that got through the screening process, 22 were enrolled onto the study, and these completed baseline of actigraphy, sleep diaries and questionnaires. All 22 commenced the study, and night 1 of polysomnography determined whether these patients actually had apnea or periodic leg movement disorder. And only 2 actually met the threshold for apnea. So of those 22 that were initially included, only 2 were excluded. Still 20% of the sample. But it's important to note that there were no dropouts. Patients were really highly motivated to take part in this study. Okay, and that's just showing that there was no dropout, and patients were excluded on the basis of apnea index. And that's, again, difficult for you to read, but it's just showing the amount of equipment that is involved. Leg and pulse oximetry, heart rate monitors, position sensors, thermal flow and pressure sensors, even head, chin, facial electrodes are applied. And I would go to patients' houses for 3 nights, for 2 hours per night to set this up, and then go back the following morning to take the data away. And also there will be active watch for the 3 days as well. And that's what the data looks like when I upload it the following morning. Really raw, but it gives me a sense of what sleep stages are occurring and the amount of REM and deep sleep that would be occurring as well. But this all got sent off to America to be scored manually for more robust analysis. Now, it's just preliminary data, but I'm going to talk you through the main outcome measures of interest for us. We wanted to look at continuity of sleep and architectural aspects of sleep. So this relates to things like total sleep time, how long it takes patients to get to sleep, and the number of duration of awakenings, but also something called sleep efficiency. So that's the discrepancy between the amount of time in bed and also the amount of time spent asleep. We also looked at sleep stages and the transitions between these as well. Again, you won't be able to see this because it's tiny, but the main differences when we did a comparison of normal sleepers against chronic fatigue patients was they differed in terms of awakening. So wake after sleep onset again, there was more of that in patients than controls, as you'd expect. Percentage of wake was also higher for patients, and sleep efficiency was much lower in patients as well. So there were more detriments to the amount of time spent asleep as opposed to the duration of time spent in bed. A number of awakenings as well was more frequent in patients. So the main outcomes of this study were, was the assessment feasible in this patient group? And it was successful, methods were acceptable to patients, and patients were really highly motivated to continue with it. They tolerated the procedures well, although there were minor considerations for some of the equipment that we would take forward for further research. But they did adhere to the sleep and cortisol protocol and the timing of this effectively. In terms of the preliminary data we took from this study, the key aspect of it was the increased amounts of light sleep and wakefulness that occurred in patients. And I haven't covered it, but we looked at the differences across nights on the sleep variables, and it showed us that there wasn't too much of a discrepancy from each night in patients on their sleep variables, so it didn't change too much. So we could get away in the future with just doing 2 nights rather than 3, which is quite good in terms of patient burden. And unfortunately, I can't give you any detail on the cortisol data because it's still being analysed. The key message to take away from this study, though, is that we can develop a future trial with such a comprehensive protocol because patients didn't find it too heavy. It worked well. So long as we go out to the homes, because I wouldn't believe many would come into the lab. It would be too much. So to conclude then, it gives some implications for how this might apply in the clinic. We established a feasible protocol to assess sleep and cortisol in MECFS. One night of polysomnography means we can detect a primary sleep disorder and thus rule this out and go on to give more appropriate treatments. 2 nights is sufficient to capture the actual sleep physiology of patients, but we also need to consider daytime sleep. One of the patients in my feasibility study, we didn't actually capture her sleep at night because she resorted to sleeping during the day, the following day. So we had to exclude that data, but it really just shows how a 24-hour assessment of sleep is quite necessary in this patient group. Light sleep was a feature throughout, so there was lots of awakenings and fragmentation. And we might want to follow potential cortical arousal issues up in this patient group. And we also need to consider sleep not just on its own, but in the context of other factors. It's a condition of multiple factors. And if you think about people, how they adjust to the illness, the severity, and also people's differential management, it all impacts on the nature of the sleep complaints. So we need to think of it as a holistic approach. In the clinic, we need to then routinely screen for primary sleep disorders and early on to avoid mistreatment. We need to be mindful of the sleep phenotypes that I identified in my third study. These sleep profiles might well be treated for the sleep in different ways. So clinicians need to be mindful of these sleep types when tailoring the sleep-based interventions for patients. So if we target disturbed sleep and napping during treatment early on, we might well improve other symptoms such as fatigue and cognitive functioning and relieve some of the symptoms in patients. I can talk about my current work in a little more detail later, but for the purposes of time, I'm currently now applying everything I've learned into a clinical setting. So I talked about the Crest of Fatigue clinic earlier, and I actually run the sleep side of things. So I offer to fatigue-associated chronic conditions, which covers MECFS, an opportunity to manage those sleep disturbances. So I'm understanding this all now in terms of a treatment level and taking this forward for my research in the future. And that's everybody that helped me to achieve my PhD and get me through it to the end. Importantly though, the patients that actually got involved, there would be nothing to write up without their involvement, so that's the ultimate thanks would actually go out to the patients. And obviously the funding from Action Friendly, who helped me develop such an intensive protocol for my final study. And that's how you can stay connected to our research. If you really want to follow what we're doing, it's good to be on that Facebook page because we're continually updating what we're doing in the North East. So thank you for listening.